The wagon lurched to a halt at the base of the mountains, and Amelia Grace knew before her father even spoke that they were leaving her behind. She sat in the back of the covered wagon, her twisted leg folded beneath her skirts, watching through the canvas opening as her father climbed down and spoke in hushed tones with the wagon master. It was September 1873, and their wagon train had been crawling west from Missouri for 3 months, bound for the goldfields and orchards of California. They had reached the Sierra Nevada range, and the pass ahead was steep, rocky, and treacherous. Every ounce of weight mattered now. Amelia. Her father's voice was tight when he finally came to her. His face had aged 10 years in the past months, carved deep with lines of worry and something harder. Something that looked like resignation. The wagon master says we need to lighten our load. The pass is too steep. We have to leave things behind. She looked at him steadily, this man who had once carried her on his shoulders through the streets of St. Louis, who had promised her mother on her deathbed that he would take care of their daughter. What things, Papa? He could not meet her eyes. There is a settlement, Julian, just on the other side of these mountains. Small mining town, but they say it is civilized enough. We will send for you once we are established in Sacramento, once we have a proper house. The words settled over her like a shroud. They were not leaving things. They were leaving her. I see, she said quietly, and she did see. She saw how the other families had begun to look at her as the journey grew harder, how they whispered that a crippled girl was bad luck, that she slowed them down. She saw how her father's new wife, Sarah, barely 3 months married before they left Missouri, had started to treat her like an inconvenient piece of furniture. She saw it all with the clear, painful sight of someone who had learned young that the world was not kind to those who were different. Her leg had been twisted from birth, turned inward at an unnatural angle. She could walk with the aid of a crutch, but slowly, painfully, and never far. She had made the journey in the back of the wagon, mending clothes and preparing meals and trying to be useful in whatever small ways she could. It had not been enough. There is a woman there, Mrs. Henderson, her father continued, his words coming faster now, eager to be done with this. She runs a boarding house. She has agreed to take you in. You can work for your keep cooking and mending. It is a respectable situation. Respectable. The word tasted like ash. What he meant was that it was cheap, that it required nothing of him but a small payment and the ability to walk away. When will you send for me? She asked, though she already knew the answer. Soon, he said, and they both knew it was a lie. 2 days later, she stood in the dusty main street of Julian, California, watching the wagon train disappear into the distance without her. The town was smaller than she had imagined, just a handful of rough buildings clustered in a valley surrounded by oak and pine trees. It smelled of wood smoke and horses and the sharp mineral scent of earth being torn open for gold. Mrs. Henderson was a brittle woman with iron-gray hair and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. You will earn your keep, she said as she showed Amelia to a tiny room under the eaves. I run a respectable establishment and I expect hard work. Can you cook? Yes, madam. Sue? Yes, madam. Good. We have miners boarding here, rough men, but they pay on time. You will help with the cooking and the washing. Keep to yourself and do not give them any reason to think you are anything but a decent girl. Amelia bit back the bitter laugh that rose in her throat. As if any man would look twice at a crippled girl, she settled into a life she had not chosen, in a town she had never wanted to see. The work was hard, harder than anything she had done on the wagon train. She rose before dawn to prepare breakfast for the boarders, spent her days scrubbing floors and washing clothes and mending torn shirts, her twisted leg aching with every movement. At night, she collapsed into her narrow bed and tried not to think about the future stretching endlessly before her, a gray and joyless thing. The miners were rough men, as Mrs. Henderson had said, but most of them were kind enough in their way. They nodded to her when they passed, thanked her gruffly for their meals, and otherwise left her alone. She was grateful for their indifference. Weeks passed. The leaves on the oak trees turned gold and russet. The air grew crisp with the promise of winter. Amelia wrote letters to her father that went unanswered. She saved the few coins Mrs. Henderson paid her and tried not to let herself hope for anything beyond survival. Then Xavier Rourke came down from the mountains. She was hanging laundry in the yard behind the boarding house when she first saw him. It was late October, and the morning was cold enough that her breath steamed in the air. She had just finished hanging a sheet when she heard the sound of boots on the wooden walkway out front, heavier and slower than the usual quick step of the miners. Curious, despite herself, she made her way around the side of the building, leaning on her crutch. A man stood at the front door, so tall his head nearly reached the top of the frame. He was broader than any man she had ever seen, with shoulders that strained the seams of his buckskin shirt and arms thick with muscle. His hair was dark and wavy, hanging past his collar, and his face was weathered and strong, all hard angles and stern lines. A full beard covered his jaw, and his eyes, when they swept over the street, were the pale blue of glacier ice. He looked like something out of a legend, like one of the mountain men from the stories her mother used to tell her. Wild and powerful and utterly outside the normal bounds of civilization. Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, and Amelia heard her sharp intake of breath. "Mr. Rourke, I did not expect you down from your mountain this early." "Need supplies," the man said. His voice was deep, resonant with a slight roughness to it, as if he did not use it often. "And a meal that I did not have to cook myself, of course. Come in." Mrs. Henderson stepped aside, and the man ducked through the doorway. His eyes passed over Amelia for a brief moment, indifferent, and then he was gone inside. "Who is that?" Amelia asked one of the other boarders later that day, a young miner named Tom who sometimes helped her carry water. "Xavier Rourke," Tom said, his voice carrying a note of respect that bordered on awe. "Lives up in the high country, traps for furs and hunts. Comes down maybe 3-4 times a year for supplies. They say he is the strongest man in the Sierras. They say he once carried a full-grown bear on his back for 5 miles. "That is impossible," Amelia said. Tom shrugged. "Maybe, but I have seen him lift things that would take 3 normal men. And I have seen the size of the pelts he brings down. Whatever he is not a man to cross." Amelia thought about this as she went about her work. Xavier Rourke stayed at the boarding house for 3 days, taking his meals in silence and speaking to no one unless spoken to first. He was not rude exactly, but distant, as if the world of the town was something that did not quite touch him. She found herself watching him despite herself, fascinated by the sheer presence of him, the way he seemed to fill whatever space he occupied. On the 3rd evening, she was carrying a stack of clean plates to the dining room when her crutch caught on the edge of a rug. She stumbled, the plates flying from her hands. She managed to catch herself against the wall, but the plates shattered on the floor with a crash that seemed deafening in the quiet house. Mrs. Henderson appeared instantly, her face flushed with anger. "Clumsy girl, do you know how much those cost?" "I am sorry," Amelia said, her voice tight. "I will pay for them." "You certainly will. That comes out of your wages." Amelia looked down at the shattered porcelain, calculating rapidly. The plates would cost more than she earned in a month. She would have nothing left over. Nothing to save. The future she had been trying so hard to build toward, the hope of someday having enough money to leave, to find her own way, receded even further into impossibility. "Perhaps you should be more careful about what tasks you give to a crippled girl." The voice was Xavier Rourke's, cool and measured. Amelia looked up in surprise. He stood in the doorway to the dining room, his pale eyes fixed on Mrs. Henderson. The older woman stiffened. "I beg your pardon, the rug," he said, gesturing with one large hand. It was folded at the corner, easy to catch a crutch on. Not her fault. She should have been watching where she was going. She was carrying a load that blocked her view. He stepped forward, and despite his calm tone, there was something in his presence that made Mrs. Henderson take a step back. "Seems to me that the fault lies in asking her to carry too much at once." There was a long moment of tense silence. Then Mrs. Henderson said stiffly, "Nevertheless, the plates are broken." Xavier reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of coins. He dropped them on the nearby table with a heavy clink. "That should cover it." "And her wages for the month, Mr. Rourke. That is not necessary." "I say it is." His voice remained level, but there was iron beneath it. "Now, if you will excuse me, I have an early start tomorrow." He turned and walked back toward his room, leaving Amelia staring after him in stunned silence. That night, she lay in her narrow bed and tried to understand why a stranger would have done such a thing for her. She had grown accustomed to people looking past her, through her, as if her twisted leg made her invisible. Xavier Rourke had not looked through her. He had seen exactly what had happened, and he had cared enough to step in. It was such a small thing. It should not have mattered so much. But lying there in the darkness, she felt something shift inside her chest, like ice beginning to crack. The next morning, Xavier was gone before dawn. Amelia told herself she was not disappointed, that it made no difference to her whether a mountain man she barely knew stayed or went. But she found herself listening for the heavy sound of his boots anyway, found herself glancing toward the door more often than she should. November arrived, and with it the first real storms. Rain lashed the town for days at a time, turning the streets into rivers of mud. The mountains disappeared behind sheets of gray, and the temperature dropped until Amelia's breath steamed even inside the house. The boarders grumbled about the cold, and Mrs. Henderson became even more short-tempered than usual, snapping at Amelia for the smallest infractions. Amelia endured it all with the same quiet patience she had learned over the years. What else could she do? She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. Her father's letters, when they finally came, were brief and impersonal, full of vague promises about sending for her soon that she no longer believed. She was trapped here, and she knew it. Then, in the 3rd week of November, Xavier Rourke came down from the mountains again. Amelia was in the kitchen when she heard his voice in the front hall, that deep rumble that seemed to resonate in her chest. Her hands stilled in the bread dough she was kneading, and she listened shamelessly as he spoke with Mrs. Henderson about a room. "Just for the night," he was saying. "Storm caught me halfway down. The pass will be snowed in within the week." "Of course, Mr. Rourke. Will you be staying in town for the winter then?" "No, going back up tomorrow if the weather holds. Just need to get the last of my supplies." Amelia's hands moved again, punching down the dough with more force than necessary. Of course he was going back up. Why would he stay? The town had nothing to offer a man like him, a man who seemed as wild and untamed as the mountains themselves. She was pulling the bread from the oven that evening when he came into the kitchen. She startled at his sudden presence, nearly dropping the hot pan. He reached out and steadied it with one hand, seemingly unbothered by the heat. "Careful," he said. "Thank you." She set the pan on the counter, acutely aware of how close he was standing, how the kitchen suddenly seemed much smaller. "Did you need something?" "Water," he said. "And I wanted to ask after you. If the old woman was giving you any trouble after last time." The casual way he called Mrs. Henderson, the old woman, startled a laugh out of her before she could stop it. She clapped a hand over her mouth, horrified. But Xavier's stern face softened just slightly at the corners. "She is treating me no worse than usual," Amelia said, reaching for a cup and filling it from the pitcher. "But thank you for asking. And thank you again for what you did." "You did not have to do that." "No," he agreed, taking the cup from her. His fingers brushed hers, rough and warm. But it was the right thing to do. He drank deeply, his eyes never leaving her face. Amelia felt heat rise to her cheeks under his scrutiny. She was not used to being looked at so directly, as if she were someone worth seeing. "What is your name?" he asked. Amelia Grace, Xavier Rourke." He set down the cup. "Where are you from?" "Amelia Grace, Missouri. We came west with a wagon train. My father left me here to go on to Sacramento." Something flickered in his pale eyes. "Left temporarily," she said automatically, though the lie tasted bitter. "He will send for me when he is settled." Xavier said nothing, but his silence was eloquent. He had seen through the lie as easily as he had seen through Mrs. Henderson's attempt to blame Amelia for the broken plates. "How long have you been alone?" he asked quietly. "I am not alone. I have employment here, and Mrs. Henderson, how long?" She looked away, her throat tight. 2 months, nearly 3. "And in that time has your father sent word? Money?" "He has written once. A single brief letter that said nothing of substance." Xavier's jaw tightened beneath his beard. "I see. It is none of your concern," Amelia said, more sharply than she intended. "I am managing well enough. Are you?" The question was gentle, but it cracked something open inside her. She felt the sudden, humiliating sting of tears behind her eyes and turned away quickly, buzzing herself with wiping down the already clean counter. "I should finish my work," she said, her voice unsteady. "Mrs. Henderson expects the kitchen cleaned before I retire." She heard him move behind her, felt his presence like heat at her back. For a moment she thought he might touch her, might offer some gesture of comfort, but he did not. Mountain men, she supposed, were not the sort to offer easy comfort. "Good night, Amelia Grace," he said softly, and then he was gone. She stood alone in the kitchen, her hands braced on the counter, and let herself cry silently for just a moment. Then she wiped her eyes, straightened her shoulders, and went back to work. The next morning dawned cold and clear, the storm having blown itself out overnight. Amelia rose in the dark as always, made her way downstairs to start the fire and begin breakfast. She was surprised to find Xavier already awake, standing by the front window and looking out at the street. "You were up early," she said. He turned, and in the dim pre-dawn light his face was all shadows and hard plains. "Wanted to get started before full light. The pass is dangerous even in good weather." "Dangerous how?" "Steep, rocky, easy to lose your footing. And if the snow starts to come in," he shrugged, "better to be on the other side before that happens." Amelia nodded, wondering why he was telling her this, why he seemed to be drawing out this conversation when he had said he wanted an early start. "Amelia," he said, and the way he said her name, careful and deliberate, made her look up sharply. "If you ever need help, if things here become," he paused, seeming to search for words. "If you need help, my cabin is a day's journey up the mountain trail. Anyone in town can tell you the way. You would be welcome there." She stared at him. "I could not possibly. I know, you are managing well enough." The faintest hint of something that might have been humor touched his voice. "But the offer stands nevertheless." He left an hour later, laden with supplies, disappearing into the pine forest that climbed toward the high peaks. Amelia watched him go from the kitchen window and tried to ignore the strange emptiness his departure left behind. The weeks that followed were the hardest yet. The winter came down from the mountains in earnest, bringing snow that piled high in the streets and ice that turned every surface treacherous. The boarding house was drafty and cold, and Mrs. Henderson seemed determined to save money by burning as little firewood as possible. Amelia's twisted leg ached constantly in the cold, a deep, grinding pain that never quite went away. She thought often of Xavier's offer, of the cabin somewhere up in those white-capped mountains. It was a foolish thing to think about. She could not simply walk away from her employment, could not go to a strange man's cabin like some desperate creature. It would be improper, it would be madness. But on the coldest nights, when her leg throbbed and her small room felt like a prison, she let herself imagine it anyway. A warm fire. A place where she was welcome rather than tolerated. The steady, solid presence of someone who had looked at her and seen a person worth helping. December arrived. The snow deepened. And then, on a morning when the cold was so bitter that ice had formed on the inside of Amelia's window, Mrs. Henderson called her into the parlor. "I have news," the older woman said without preamble. "I am closing the boarding house." Amelia felt the words like a physical blow. "Closing? My sister in San Francisco is ill. She has asked me to come and care for her. I leave in 2 days. But what about the boarders? What about me?" she wanted to say. But the words stuck in her throat. "The boarders have been informed. Most will find other arrangements. As for you," Mrs. Henderson's face was not unkind exactly, but neither was it concerned. "I have fulfilled my obligation to your father. You will have to make your own arrangements." Amelia stood very still, trying to absorb this. "I have saved very little money. Certainly not enough to that is unfortunate. But I cannot help that. You are a capable girl. I am sure you will find something." The dismissal was clear. Amelia turned and walked carefully from the room, her crutch tapping on the wooden floor. She made it back to the kitchen before the full weight of it hit her. She was going to be homeless, in the middle of winter. In a town where she knew almost no one, where there were no other boarding houses, no families looking for help. She could try to find work in one of the saloons, but she knew what that would mean. What kind of work a crippled girl with no family and no prospects could expect to find. The thought made her stomach turn. For the first time since her father had left her here, she let herself feel the full depth of her despair. She sank into a chair, buried her face in her hands, and let the tears come. That was how Tom the miner found her an hour later. "Miss Grace?" His young face was creased with concern. "What has happened?" she told him, the words tumbling out between sobs. He listened with growing dismay, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "There is no one else in town who could take you in," he said finally. "The saloon keepers would hire you, but I know what they would expect," she said quietly. "Yes." He rubbed the back of his neck, clearly troubled. Then his face brightened slightly. "What about Xavier Rourke?" Amelia looked up sharply. "What about him? He offered you help, did he not? I heard him mention it to Mrs. Henderson before he left. Said if you ever needed anything, you could come to his cabin." "I could not possibly go to a strange man's cabin alone." "It would be better than the alternative?" Tom asked bluntly. "Miss Grace, Xavier Rourke is the most honorable man I know. He would not harm you. And he is right that his cabin would be safer than anything you will find in town." "But the pass," Amelia said. "He said it would be snowed in." "Not yet. Not completely. It is dangerous, yes, but passable if you have someone who knows the way." He hesitated. "I could guide you. I have been up that trail before. It would take a full day, but we could make it if we leave soon." "Tom, I could not ask you to. You are not asking. I am offering." His young face was determined. "You have been kind to me since I came to Julian. Let me do this for you." Amelia sat very still, weighing her options. They were few, and none of them were good. She could stay in town and hope to find some other employment, but she knew how unlikely that was. She could try to make it to another town, but she had no money for passage and no way to travel with her twisted leg. Or she could accept Tom's offer, could take Xavier at his word and go to his cabin. It was a risk. He might turn her away, he might expect things from her that she could not give. But when she thought of his pale blue eyes, of the quiet strength in his voice when he had defended her, something in her said that he was not that kind of man. "All right," she said quietly, "I will go." They left before dawn the next morning. Tom had borrowed a mule for Amelia to ride, knowing she could not walk the distance. She packed her few belongings into a small bag, left a brief note for Mrs. Henderson, and slipped out into the frozen darkness. The trail climbed steadily from the moment they left town, winding up through pine forests, heavy with snow. The world was silent except for the crunch of their footsteps and the occasional whisper of wind through the branches. The cold was intense, biting through Amelia's cloak and dress until she shivered constantly despite the steady movement. Tom led the mule with patient determination, pointing out landmarks and trail markers as they went. "See that blaze on the tree there? Xavier marks his trail so it can be followed even in snow. He is thoughtful that way." "How well do you know him?" Amelia asked, her teeth chattering. "Not well. No one knows him well. But I worked a claim near his cabin one summer and he helped me when I got sick, brought me food, made sure I had water. Never asked for anything in return." Tom glanced back at her. "He is a good man, solitary but good." They climbed higher. The sun rose, turning the snow to blinding white. Amelia pulled her bonnet low over her face and tried to ignore the growing ache in her leg. The way the cold made it stiffen until every movement was agony. By midday, they had reached a place where the trail narrowed dramatically, cut into the side of the mountain with a steep drop on one side. Amelia looked down and felt her stomach lurch. Below them, the mountainside fell away in a tumble of rocks and snow-covered pines, dropping hundreds of feet to the valley floor. "This is the hardest part," Tom said. "The pass itself. It is narrow but not long. Just keep steady." They started across. The mule picked its way carefully, and Amelia gripped the saddle horn with both hands, afraid to look down. They were halfway across when she heard a crack like a rifle shot. "What was that?" she asked. Tom had gone very still. Ice, the trail, the world seemed to move in slow motion. The mule lurched sideways as the ice beneath its hooves gave way. Amelia felt herself sliding, felt the saddle tilt beneath her. She had one terrible moment to understand what was happening, and then she was falling. She hit the slope hard, the breath knocked from her lungs. She tumbled, snow and rocks and sky spinning in a confused whirl. Her twisted leg hit something solid and pain exploded through her, white hot and blinding. She clawed at the snow, trying to stop her slide, and finally caught hold of a small pine tree growing from the mountainside. She clung to it, gasping, pain radiating from her leg in waves. Above her, she could hear Tom shouting her name. She tried to call back, but she could not get enough air. "Hold on," Tom yelled. "I am coming." But when she looked up, she could see that he would not be able to reach her. The slope between them was too steep, too unstable. If he tried to climb down, he would likely fall himself. "Tom," she called up, her voice shaking. "Go get help. You cannot reach me from there. I cannot leave you. You have to. Go to Xavier. Tell him where I am. He will know what to do." There was a long pause. Then Tom said, "I will run. Hold on, Miss Grace. Just hold on." She heard him scramble away, his footsteps fading quickly. Then there was only silence and the whisper of the wind and the terrible grinding pain in her leg. She did not know how long she clung to that tree. Time seemed to stretch and blur, measured only by the waves of pain and the growing numbness in her fingers. She tried to pull herself higher, but her twisted leg would not support any weight, and every movement sent fresh agony shooting through her. The cold was seeping into her bones, making her drowsy. She knew that was dangerous, knew she had to stay awake, but it was so hard. She thought of her mother, of the stories she used to tell, of her father who had left her behind, of all the small kindnesses and cruelties that had led her to this moment, clinging to a pine tree on a frozen mountainside. It seemed like such a foolish way to die. Then she heard a voice, rough and urgent. "Amelia." She forced her eyes open. Above her, silhouetted against the bright sky, was Xavier Rourke. He was lying on his stomach at the edge of the broken trail, looking down at her. "Can you hold on a little longer?" he called. "I think so," she managed to say. "Good."
"Do not let go. I am coming to you."
She watched through blurred vision as he disappeared from sight. There was a terrible few moments where she heard nothing, saw nothing. Then he appeared on the slope below her, climbing toward her with impossible steadiness. He had a rope tied around his waist, anchored somewhere above, and he moved across the steep icy slope as if it were flat ground. When he reached her, his pale eyes swept over her, assessing. "Are you hurt? My leg? I cannot walk." "That is all right." His voice was calm, absolutely steady. "I am going to lift you now. Put your arms around my neck." She did as he said, and he pulled her carefully away from the tree. Pain lanced through her leg, and she bit back a cry. Xavier's arms came around her, solid and strong, and he shifted her weight until she was secure against his chest. "Hold tight," he said, and began to climb. It was like nothing Amelia had ever experienced. Xavier moved up the slope with slow, deliberate care, his breathing steady despite the fact that he was carrying her full weight. His muscles bunched and flexed beneath her hands, powerful and sure. When they reached the rope, he used it to pull them both up the steepest section, his strength seemingly inexhaustible. Finally, impossibly, they reached the trail. Tom was there, white-faced and shaking. Xavier laid Amelia down carefully on solid ground and immediately began checking her for injuries. "Her leg," Tom said. She said her leg was hurt. Xavier's hands were gentle as they probed the twisted limb. Amelia hissed in pain and he stopped immediately. "I think it is badly bruised, maybe sprained. Difficult to tell with," he paused delicately. "We need to get her somewhere warm. Tom, can you lead the mule?" "Yes, sir." Xavier looked down at Amelia. "I am going to carry you. It is not far to my cabin now. Can you bear it?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, settling her carefully against his broad chest. She could feel the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek, the warmth of him seeping through her frozen clothes. He started walking, his stride long, and even despite the burden. Tom followed with the mule, and they made their way up the trail as the afternoon light began to fade. Amelia drifted in and out of awareness, the pain and cold and exhaustion catching up with her all at once. She was dimly aware of the forest around them, of Xavier's arms solid and warm, of his voice rumbling in his chest as he spoke occasionally to Tom. At some point, She realized he had shifted her higher, had settled her weight across his shoulders like she was something precious to be carried carefully. The position eased some of the pressure on her leg, and she found herself able to breathe more easily. "Thank you," she whispered. She felt rather than heard his response, a low rumble that might have been, "You are welcome." Darkness was falling when they finally reached the cabin. It was larger than Amelia had expected, built of solid logs with a stone chimney. Xavier carried her inside and laid her on a bed covered in thick furs. She had a confused impression of a single large room, warmly lit by a fire in the hearth, with walls lined with shelves and pegs holding supplies and equipment. "Tom, stoke up the fire," Xavier said, his voice taking on a tone of command that the younger man immediately obeyed. "There is coffee in the pot on the shelf and beans warming on the back of the stove. Help yourself." He knelt beside the bed and carefully began removing Amelia's wet, frozen cloak. His hands were steady and impersonal, efficient. When he reached her boots, he hesitated. "This may hurt," he said quietly. She nodded, bracing herself. He worked the boot off her injured leg as gently as he could, but she still cried out. The leg was swollen and discolored, the twisted foot even more misshapen than usual. Xavier's face was grim as he examined it. "Bad sprain, as I thought. Maybe a fracture, hard to tell. I will wrap it for now, keep it elevated. The swelling should go down in a few days." He worked in silence, wrapping the leg in strips of clean cloth with practiced skill. Amelia watched his face as he worked, the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the care he took not to hurt her more than necessary. When he finished, he pulled a fur blanket over her. "Rest now," he said. "You are safe," and looking into his pale blue eyes, Amelia believed him. She slept deeply that night, exhaustion and pain dragging her down into darkness. When she woke, pale winter sunlight was streaming through the cabin's single window. The fire was burning low, and she could hear the sound of someone moving around the room. She turned her head carefully and saw Xavier at the table, working on something with his back to her. The cabin looked different in daylight, less intimidating. It was surprisingly neat for a bachelor's dwelling with everything in its place. Furs hung on the walls alongside traps and snowshoes. A rifle rested above the door. Shelves held supplies, carefully organized. It was a place built for survival, but there was a sense of care to it, of someone who took pride in his home. "You are awake," Xavier said without turning around. "How is the leg?" "It hurts," she admitted, "but not as badly as yesterday." He came over to the bed carrying a cup. "Coffee, it will help." She struggled to sit up, and he reached out to help her, propping her against the log wall with surprising gentleness. She took the cup gratefully, wrapping her cold hands around its warmth. "Tom," she asked. "I sent him back down the mountain at first light. He wanted to stay, but the pass is getting worse. By tomorrow, it will be closed completely. He would have been trapped here all winter, and I am trapped here," Amelia said quietly. Xavier's expression did not change. "You are safe here, that is what matters. But I am imposing on you. You did not ask for." "I offered," he interrupted. "You remember? I said if you ever needed help, you could come here. You came. I am glad you did. Even though I will be here all winter, especially because you will be here all winter, you think I would rather you had stayed in town at the mercy of—" He stopped himself, his jaw tight. "You are welcome here, Amelia Grace, for as long as you need." There was something in his voice, a quiet intensity, that made her look at him more closely. In the daylight, she could see the lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair. He was older than she had first thought, perhaps 35 or 40. But there was nothing old about the strength in his frame, the way he moved with easy power. "Thank you," she said softly. "I do not know how I will ever repay you, no repayment necessary." He stood, moving back to the table. "Are you hungry?" She was ravenously. He brought her a plate of food, simple but hearty, beans and bacon and thick slices of bread. She ate while he tended to his chores, moving around the cabin with the efficient ease of long habit. He was, she realized, completely comfortable in silence. He did not seem to need to fill the quiet with conversation the way most people did. "Xavier," she said after a while, and he looked up at her. "Why did you help me? The first time, I mean. With the plates." He considered the question for a long moment. "Because it was right," he said finally. "And because I know what it is like to be judged for something you cannot help." "What do you mean?" He was quiet for so long that she thought he would not answer. Then he said, "I came west after the war, after Gettysburg. I had seen enough of what men do to each other. I wanted to be somewhere clean, somewhere away from all that." "People judged you for that?" "They called it cowardice, running away." He shrugged. "Maybe it was. But I have found more honor in these mountains than I ever found in all those battles." Amelia understood then, at least partly. He was a man who had chosen solitude not because he hated people, but because he had seen too much of what they were capable of, and somehow in her he had seen a kindred spirit, someone else judged harshly for things beyond their control. "I am glad you came to the mountains," she said. "If you had not, I would have died yesterday." "No," he said firmly. "You would have held on. You are stronger than you know." The days that followed settled into a rhythm. Xavier cared for her with the same careful efficiency he brought to everything else, checking her injured leg, making sure she had enough to eat, stoking the fire so she was never cold. He made her a crutch from a sturdy branch, better balanced than the one she had lost in the fall. He moved his few books to the bedside so she would have something to read, and slowly, carefully, they began to talk. At first their conversations were brief, practical exchanges. But gradually, as Amelia's leg began to heal and she was able to move around the cabin more, the talks grew longer. She learned that Xavier had been a soldier before the war ended in 1865, that he had spent time trapping in the Rockies before coming to California, that he had built this cabin with his own hands, that he knew every mile of the mountains around them. In turn, she told him about Missouri, about her mother's death and her father's hasty remarriage, about the long wagon train journey and the slow, painful realization that she was a burden he wanted to be rid of. Xavier listened with an attention that was both flattering and unsettling. He seemed to hear not just her words but everything beneath them. "Your father is a fool," he said bluntly when she finished. "Any man who would leave a daughter like you behind is a fool." "A daughter like me," she repeated. "You mean a crippled one. I mean a strong one, a brave one." He met her eyes. "I have known grown men who would not have survived what you went through on that mountain. You held on. You did not give up." Something warm unfurled in Amelia's chest at his words. She was not used to being seen as strong. She was the girl with the twisted leg, the one to be pitied or dismissed. But Xavier did not pity her. He simply saw her. As the weeks passed and winter deepened outside, Amelia found herself watching him more and more. The way his muscles moved beneath his shirt when he split wood, the careful gentleness of his hands when he changed the wrapping on her leg, the rare, slight smile that sometimes touched his stern face when she said something that amused him. She was falling in love with him, she realized one evening as she watched him repair a trap by the firelight. The realization should have frightened her. She barely knew him. He was so much older than her 22 years, so different from anyone she had ever known, but there was something right about it, something that felt as inevitable as the snow falling outside. The question was whether he felt anything for her. He was unfailingly kind, but that might simply be his nature. He treated her with respect, but he would treat any guest that way. He never touched her except when necessary. Never gave any sign that he saw her as anything other than someone he was helping through a difficult time. Christmas came and went, marked only by Xavier shooting a turkey and Amelia making biscuits with the last of the sugar. They ate by firelight, and Xavier told her stories of previous winters in the mountains, of the silence and beauty of the high country when snow covered everything. "You love it here," she said. "Yes." He looked at her across the table. "Does that seem strange to you?" "No. I think I am beginning to understand it." She gestured toward the window where moonlight turned the snow to silver. "There is a peace here. Everything is simple. Clear. That is exactly it." He smiled, a real smile this time, and her heart turned over in her chest. That night, lying in the bed while Xavier slept in his bedroll by the fire, as he had every night since she arrived, Amelia made a decision. She would tell him how she felt. The worst he could do was say he did not return her feelings, and if that happened, well, she survived it. She had survived worse. But the next morning, before she could find the words, everything changed. She woke to the sound of Xavier swearing, which was unusual enough that she sat up immediately. He was at the window looking out with a grim expression. "What is it?" she asked. "Storm," he said. "A bad one. Moving in fast." She came to join him at the window, leaning on her crutch. The sky to the west was dark, an ominous wall of clouds rolling toward them. The wind was already picking up, sending snow devils spinning across the clearing. "How bad?" she asked. "Bad enough. We need to get everything secured. If it is what I think it is, we will be trapped inside for days." They spent the morning preparing. Xavier brought in extra firewood, stacking it along the wall. He secured the shutters, checked the roof for weak spots, brought in snow to melt for water. Amelia helped as much as she could, moving supplies, organizing the food stores. By the time they finished, the storm was howling around the cabin, the wind shrieking through the pines. Xavier barred the door and turned to face her. "We are as ready as we can be. Now we wait." The storm raged for 3 days. The wind was so loud that conversation was nearly impossible. Snow piled against the door, and Xavier had to dig them out twice a day just to keep from being completely buried. The cabin shook with each gust, and Amelia found herself wondering if it would hold. But Xavier seemed unconcerned. "She has weathered worse," he said, patting the log wall affectionately. Trapped inside with nothing to do but wait out the storm, they fell back on the thing they had come to do best, talking. Amelia told him stories from her childhood, about her mother's garden, and the games she used to play with the neighbor children before her difference made her too much of an outsider. Xavier told her about his years in the army, though she noticed he did not speak of the battles themselves, only of the men he had known, the places he had seen. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. The company of other people? He thought about this, sometimes. But most people are not easy to be around. They want things from you. They judge you. Here I am judged only by whether I can survive, whether I am strong enough and smart enough to live through another winter. That is a cleaner kind of judgment. Am I easy to be around? The question slipped out before she could stop it. He looked at her, and something in his pale eyes made her breath catch. Yes, he said softly, you are. On the third night, the wind finally began to die down. The cabin was warm from the fire, and they sat together at the table, playing cards with a worn deck Xavier had produced from somewhere. Amelia was acutely aware of how close they were sitting, of the way Xavier's shoulder occasionally brushed hers when he reached for a card. I am glad the storm is passing, she said, trying to focus on the game. But I will miss this, being here with you. Xavier's hand stilled. You will? Yes. She set down her cards and looked at him directly. Xavier, I need to tell you something. He put his own cards down, giving her his full attention. All right. Now that the moment had come, the words were harder to find than she had expected. I know I have been here only a few weeks. I know this is sudden. But she took a breath. I care for you more than I should, probably. More than is wise. But I do, and I thought you should know. Xavier was very still. His face gave nothing away, and for a terrible moment, Amelia thought she had made a horrible mistake. Then he reached across the table and took her hand in his. Amelia, he said, his voice rough. I have been trying so hard not to. You are young and you have been through so much. I did not want to take advantage. Did not want you to feel obligated. Obligated? She laughed shakily. Xavier, I am in love with you. That is not obligation. His hand tightened on hers. You are sure? You barely know me. I know enough. I know you are good and strong and kind. I know you see me as a person, not as a burden or a cripple. I know. Her voice broke. I know I have never felt safer with anyone in my life. For a moment he just looked at her, his pale eyes searching her face. Then he stood, pulling her gently to her feet. He cupped her face in his large hands, and she saw everything she needed to see in his expression. Wonder, joy, and something deeper, something that made her heart race. I love you, he said, the words like a vow. I have loved you since you stood in Mrs. Henderson's kitchen and laughed at me, calling her the old woman. I have loved you through every day you have been here. I have been falling more in love with you with every conversation, every smile. But I thought. She reached up and pulled his head down to hers, and when their lips met, it was like coming home. He kissed her gently at first, as if she were something fragile that might break. But when she pressed closer, her arms going around his neck, the kiss deepened. His arms came around her, pulling her against his chest, and she felt the leashed strength in him, the want that he had been holding back. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. Marry me, he said. When the pass clears in spring, we will go down to Julian, find a preacher. Marry me, Amelia. Yes, she said without hesitation. Yes, absolutely yes. He laughed. The sound surprised and joyful, and kissed her again. And Amelia thought that she had been so wrong about her life being over when her father left her in Julian. It had not been an ending at all. It had been the beginning. They talked late into the night, planning their future. Xavier wanted to build an addition to the cabin, a proper room for them to share. Amelia suggested they might think about raising sheep or goats, something to supplement his trapping income. They talked about what their life together might look like, the practicalities and the dreams all tangled together. It will not be an easy life, Xavier warned her. Winters are hard up here. We will be isolated. You might find you miss the company of other women, the things a town offers. I might, Amelia agreed. But I would rather be here with you than anywhere else without you. He pulled her close and she rested her head on his shoulder, feeling his heart beat steady and strong beneath her ear. This was what she had been searching for without even knowing it. Not just love, though there was that in abundance, but belonging. A place where she was not just tolerated but wanted. A man who saw her as a partner, not a burden. I will spend every day of my life making sure you never regret this, Xavier said quietly into her hair. I know, she said, and she did. The winter passed in a haze of happiness. Xavier taught her about the mountains, about reading the weather and the signs of the animals. He showed her his trap lines, carrying her on his back when the snow was too deep for her to manage with her crutch. He was patient with her limitations, finding ways to adapt so she could participate in as much of the work as possible. In turn, she made the cabin a home. She sewed curtains from spare fabric, organized the supplies more efficiently, cooked meals that were more elaborate than the simple fare Xavier had been living on. She sang while she worked, old songs her mother had taught her, and Xavier would stop whatever he was doing just to listen. They were careful with each other at first, mindful of propriety even though they were alone in the wilderness. But as the weeks passed and their wedding plans grew more concrete, the barriers between them began to dissolve. Xavier held her while they slept, his body warm and solid against her back. She kissed him freely, delighting in the way his stern face softened when she did. They existed in a bubble of contentment, waiting for spring. February brought the first hint that the worst of the winter was passing. The days grew fractionally longer. The storms came less frequently. Xavier began to talk about when they might be able to make the journey down to Julian. "Another month," he said one evening as they sat by the fire. "Maybe 6 weeks. The pass should be clear enough by then, and then we will be married," Amelia said, smiling. "And then we will be married," he confirmed. He reached over and took her hand, running his thumb over her knuckles. "Are you certain you want this? Once we are married, there is no going back. You will be tied to a mountain man who lives half the year in isolation." "I have never been more certain of anything," she said firmly. "Xavier, you saved my life, but more than that, you gave me a reason to want to live it. I was so lost before I came here. I thought my life was over, that I would spend the rest of my days just surviving, just getting by. But with you, I can see a future, a real one, with joy and purpose and love. How could I not want that?" His eyes were suspiciously bright. "You humble me," he said quietly. "Good," she said, smiling to lighten the mood. "Someone needs to keep you humble." He laughed and pulled her into his arms. She went willingly, settling against his chest with the easy comfort of long familiarity. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, but inside the cabin was warm and filled with light. March arrived with surprising warmth. The snow began to melt in earnest, running off the roof in streams, turning the clearing around the cabin into a muddy mess. Xavier began preparing for their journey down the mountain, checking his supplies, making sure they had enough provisions for the trip. "We will stay in Julian for a few days after the wedding," he said as they planned. "Give you a chance to say goodbye to anyone you want to say goodbye to. Tom, perhaps. And we should send word to your father. Let him know you are well." Amelia's first instinct was to say no, that she wanted nothing to do with her father. But then she thought about it more carefully. She did not need his approval or his blessing, but perhaps for her own peace of mind she needed to let him know that she had found happiness despite his abandonment. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." They left on a bright morning in mid-March. The pass was clear, though still treacherous with meltwater and loose rocks. Xavier carried most of their supplies, his strength seemingly inexhaustible. When the trail grew too difficult for Amelia to manage with her crutch, he simply picked her up and carried her, settling her weight across his shoulders as he had that first day. She laughed at the improbability of it, this huge man carrying her through the mountains like she was something precious. "What is so funny?" he asked, his voice rumbling beneath her. "I am sitting on your shoulders like a child. It is undignified." "You are sitting on my shoulders like treasure," he corrected. "There is a difference." Her heart swelled with love for him. "Yes," she said softly. "There is." The journey down took most of the day. By the time they reached Julian, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The town looked the same as when Amelia had left it, but everything felt different. She was different. They found lodging at a new boarding house that had opened in Mrs. Henderson's absence. The proprietor, a kindly woman named Mrs. Chen, clucked over Amelia's twisted leg and Xavier's mountain man appearance with equal concern and delight. "A wedding," she exclaimed when they explained why they had come. "How wonderful! We must make sure everything is perfect." The next day they found a preacher. Reverend Thompson was a circuit rider who happened to be in town, and he agreed to perform the ceremony the following afternoon. Tom, who was overjoyed to see Amelia alive and well, offered to stand as a witness. Mrs. Chen insisted on providing a wedding supper. The morning of the wedding, Amelia woke early in the small room Mrs. Chen had given her. She stood at the window, looking out at the mountains in the distance, thinking about how much had changed in the past few months. She had come to this town broken and abandoned, believing her life was over. Now she stood on the threshold of a new beginning, with a man who loved her completely, twisted leg and all. There was a soft knock on the door. "Come in," she called. Mrs. Chen entered, carrying a dress over her arm. "I thought you might like to borrow this," she said. "It was my daughter's. She left it here when she married and moved to San Francisco." The dress was beautiful, soft blue wool with delicate white lace at the collar and cuffs. Amelia touched it reverently. "Are you sure?" "I am sure. Every bride deserves to feel beautiful on her wedding day." With Mrs. Chen's help, Amelia dressed carefully. The older woman brushed out her hair and pinned it up, leaving a few curls to frame her face. When Amelia finally looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. She looked happy. She looked loved. "He is a lucky man," Mrs. Chen said softly. "I am a lucky woman," Amelia replied. The ceremony took place in the small church at the edge of town. It was simple and brief, with only Tom and Mrs. Chen as witnesses. But when Xavier took her hands and spoke his vows, his pale blue eyes locked on hers, Amelia felt like they were the only two people in the world. "I promise to love you and protect you for all the days of my life," Xavier said, his deep voice steady and sure. "To be your partner in all things, in hardship and in joy. To see you, truly see you, every day, and to cherish what I see." Tears streamed down Amelia's face as she spoke her own vows. I promise to love you with all that I am, to stand beside you, to build a life with you, to bring light to your solitude and peace to your heart, to choose you every day for as long as we both shall live. When Reverend Thompson pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier pulled her into his arms and kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. The small gathering cheered, and Amelia laughed against his mouth, giddy with happiness. The wedding supper that evening was a joyful affair. Mrs. Chen had outdone herself, preparing a feast that seemed impossible for one person to have made. Tom regaled them with exaggerated stories of his mining exploits, and even Xavier laughed, his arm around Amelia's shoulders, his face more relaxed than she had ever seen it. Later, when they were finally alone in the room Mrs. Chen had prepared for them, Xavier pulled Amelia close and simply held her for a long moment. "My wife," he said wonderingly. "My husband," she replied, smiling up at him. He kissed her then, deep and slow, and Amelia felt the last of her reservations melt away. This was right. This was where she was meant to be. In his arms, building a life in the mountains, loved completely for exactly who she was. They spent 3 days in Julian, and during that time, Amelia penned a letter to her father. She kept it brief and factual, informing him that she had married and was well, that he need not concern himself with her welfare any longer. She did not mention how he had abandoned her, did not accuse or plead. She simply stated the facts and signed her new name, Amelia Rourke. If he ever responded, she never knew. By the time any reply could have reached them, they were already back in the mountains, in the cabin that was now truly her home. The spring and summer that followed were the happiest of Amelia's life. Xavier taught her everything about living in the mountains, from which plants were edible to how to read the signs of approaching weather. She proved to be a quick study, and her twisted leg, while it still limited her in some ways, was less of a hindrance in the wilderness than it had been in town. She learned to move over rough terrain with her crutch, and Xavier was always there to help when the way grew too difficult. In turn, she brought a warmth to his life that had been missing. She filled the cabin with small touches of beauty: wildflowers in a tin cup, curtains that let in the light, meals that were as much about pleasure as sustenance. She sang while she worked, and Xavier would sometimes stop what he was doing just to listen, a slight smile on his stern face. They worked together to expand the cabin, adding a second room and a small porch. Xavier did the heavy work, but Amelia helped where she could, handing him tools, holding boards steady. It was hard work but satisfying, watching their home grow to accommodate their life together. In July, a traveling preacher and his wife came through the mountains and stayed with them for a few days. It was the first real company they had had since the wedding, and Amelia enjoyed having another woman to talk to. Before they left, the preacher's wife pulled Amelia aside. "You are with child," she said matter-of-factly. Amelia blinked. "What? How do you know?" "I have borne 4 children myself. I recognize the signs." "You have not realized." Amelia thought back over the past weeks, the odd queasiness in the mornings, the way certain smells had started to bother her. She had attributed it to adjusting to the mountain diet, but now that the preacher's wife mentioned it, the pieces fell into place. "I am going to have a baby," she whispered, wonder and fear warring in her chest. "You are," the woman confirmed. "I would guess you are about 3 months along. You should tell your husband." Amelia did that evening after their guests had retired to the small tent Xavier had set up for them outside. She watched him carefully as she spoke, trying to gauge his reaction. Xavier was silent for a long moment after she finished. Then he pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "A baby," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Our baby. Are you happy?" she asked against his chest. "Happy?" He pulled back to look at her, and his eyes were bright. "Amelia, I am more than happy. I am terrified and overjoyed and grateful all at once. A child. Our child." She laughed, relief flooding through her. "I am terrified too, but I think we will manage." "We will more than manage," he said firmly. "I will build a cradle. We will need more supplies, more blankets. And we should talk to Mrs. Chen. See if she knows of a midwife who might be willing to come up the mountain when the time comes." They spent the rest of the evening making plans, their fear and excitement all tangled together. A baby, a family. The future they were building together suddenly felt more real, more precious. The months that followed were not without their challenges. Amelia's pregnancy was difficult at times, particularly given the isolation and the physical demands of mountain life. But Xavier was endlessly patient, taking on more of the work, making sure she rested when she needed to. He built the promised cradle, a beautiful thing of smooth pine and careful joinery. He made trips down the mountain more frequently than usual, bringing back supplies and checking for letters from the midwife Mrs. Chen had recommended. Winter came again, and with it the familiar rhythm of snow and cold and isolation. But this year it felt different. They were not just 2 people waiting out the winter. They were a family, preparing for the arrival of their child. The baby came in early February during a break between storms. The midwife, a competent woman named Sarah who had agreed to spend the last month of Amelia's pregnancy at the cabin, helped her through the long hours of labor. Xavier paced outside, ostensibly cutting firewood but really just wearing a path in the snow. When the baby's cry finally split the air, he burst into the cabin, his face wild with worry and hope. Sarah met him at the door with a smile. "You have a daughter," she said. "A healthy, beautiful daughter. And your wife as well." Xavier brushed past her and went to the bed, where Amelia lay exhausted but smiling, a tiny bundle in her arms. When she looked up at him, her face was radiant. "Xavier, meet your daughter." He took the baby with careful, trembling hands, staring down at the tiny face with an expression of such wonder that Amelia felt tears spring to her eyes. The baby had a thatch of dark hair, and when she opened her eyes, they were the same pale blue as her father's. "She is perfect," Xavier said, his voice breaking. "Both of you perfect." "We should name her," Amelia said. "I was thinking if you agree we might call her Grace, after my mother." "Grace," Xavier repeated, testing the sound. "Grace Rourke, yes. It is perfect." He handed the baby back to Amelia and sat on the edge of the bed, his arm around his wife, looking down at their daughter. In that moment, Amelia thought about how far she had come from that girl standing in the street in Julian, watching her father's wagon disappear. She had thought her life was over, but really it had just been waiting to begin. The years that followed were full and rich. Little Grace grew into a sturdy, curious child who seemed to inherit her father's strength and her mother's determined spirit. When she was 2, Amelia gave birth to a son whom they named Thomas after the young miner who had helped save Amelia's life. 2 years after that came another daughter, Rose, with her father's pale eyes and her mother's gentle nature. The cabin grew with their family, expanding to accommodate the children. Xavier proved to be a patient, loving father, teaching his children about the mountains with the same care he had once taught Amelia. On his shoulders they rode through the high country, seeing vistas that took their breath away. He carried them like treasure, just as he had carried their mother. Amelia's twisted leg remained a part of her life, but it defined her less and less as the years passed. Her children grew up seeing it simply as part of who their mother was, no more remarkable than the color of her eyes or the sound of her laugh. Xavier continued to see her as he always had, strong, capable, beautiful. They made the trip down to Julian twice a year, in spring and fall when the pass was clear. Grace and Thomas and Rose loved these trips, excited by the bustle of the town, the chance to play with other children. But they were always eager to return home, to the mountains and the quiet and the family life they loved. When Grace was 10, a letter finally came from Amelia's father. It was brief and stiff, asking if she might consider a visit, saying that Sarah had passed away and he was alone. Amelia read it twice, then folded it carefully and put it away. "Are you going to respond?" Xavier asked. "I do not know," she said honestly. "Part of me wants to. He is still my father, despite everything. But another part of me," she trailed off, "is still hurt by what he did," Xavier finished gently. "Yes." He pulled her into his arms. "Whatever you decide, I will support you, but you do not owe him anything, Amelia. He made his choices. You have made yours." In the end, she wrote back, a brief letter saying that she was well, that she had a family, but that she did not think a visit would be possible given the distance and the demands of mountain life. It was not quite a rejection, but neither was it an invitation. She signed it, "Your daughter, Amelia Rourke," and sent it off without regret. She had her own family now, her own life, and it was a good one. More years passed, the children grew. Grace proved to have her father's love of the mountains and began learning to trap alongside him. Thomas showed an aptitude for building and helped Xavier with an addition to the cabin and various improvements around their homestead. Rose had her mother's gentle nature and a gift for growing things. She started a small garden that flourished in the brief mountain summers. Amelia and Xavier aged together, their love deepening with each passing season. The passion of their early days matured into something steadier, richer. They had weathered challenges together, harsh winters, a year when the trapping was poor, a summer when Thomas fell ill, and they spent anxious weeks nursing him back to health. Through it all, they had each other. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Xavier surprised her by producing a necklace he had made himself, a delicate thing of twisted gold wire with a small pendant shaped like a pine cone. "Xavier, it is beautiful," Amelia said, touching it reverently. "When did you learn to make jewelry?" "I have been working on it for 2 years, he admitted. "Wanted to give you something special, something that showed what you mean to me." She threw her arms around his neck, tears streaming down her face. "You show me every day," she said, "in 1,000 small ways. But I love this. I will treasure it always." He clasped it around her neck, his fingers gentle against her skin. 10 years, he said. "Best 10 years of my life." "Mine too," she said, and she meant it with all her heart. When Amelia was 35 and Xavier was 52, they welcomed their last child into the world, a son they named Samuel. The pregnancy had been unexpected, coming after several years when Amelia had thought her childbearing days were done. But Samuel was a joy, a happy baby who brought laughter back into their home just as the older children were beginning to grow up and think about their own futures. Grace, now 18, had begun courting a young man from Julian, a miner's son with kind eyes and steady hands. Xavier approved of him, which Amelia took as a very good sign given how protective he was of his daughter. Thomas at 16 was talking about becoming a carpenter, maybe starting a business in Julian or one of the other mountain towns. Rose at 14 was still helping her mother and showing no signs of wanting to leave home anytime soon. Their life was good, not easy, never easy. Mountain life demanded too much for that. But good, filled with love and purpose and the deep satisfaction of building something meaningful together. On a clear morning in late spring, when Amelia was 40 and Xavier was 57, they took a walk together up to the high meadow above their cabin. It was something they did occasionally when they could steal time away from the children and the work. The meadow was carpeted with wildflowers, a riot of color against the green grass. They sat together on a sun-warmed rock, looking out over the valley below. From here, they could see Julian in the distance, a small cluster of buildings in a fold of the mountains. Beyond it, more mountains marched to the horizon, wave after wave of them, fading into the blue distance. "Do you ever regret it?" Xavier asked suddenly. "Staying here, living this life. You could have had so much more in a town, a city, an easier life." Amelia looked at him in surprise. "Regret it? Xavier, this is the best life I could have imagined. Better than I ever dreamed of." "But your leg," he said, gesturing to where her twisted limb was folded beneath her skirts. "It would be easier for you in a place with less rough terrain, with doctors nearby." "My leg is part of me," she said firmly. "It always will be. But here, with you, I am not defined by it. I am a wife, a mother, a woman building a life she loves, not a cripple, not a burden, just me." She took his hand. "Xavier, you saw me when no one else did. You carried me over that mountain pass like I was something precious, and you have been carrying me in all the ways that matter ever since. How could I regret any of that?" His eyes were suspiciously bright. "I am the one who is carried," he said roughly. "You brought light into my life, Amelia. Joy, purpose. I was half alive before you came. Then we carried each other," she said, smiling through her own tears. "We still do." He pulled her into his arms, and they sat like that for a long time, watching the sun move across the sky, listening to the wind in the pines. Two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life together in the wild mountains of California. Eventually, they made their way back down to the cabin where their children were waiting. Samuel ran to greet them, his pudgy legs churning, and Xavier scooped him up with a laugh. Grace was cooking supper, and the smell of venison stew filled the cabin. Thomas was working on a new shelf for Amelia's growing collection of herbs and medicines. Rose was reading to her younger siblings from a book of fairy tales. It was a scene of perfect, ordinary domestic happiness. And standing in the doorway, watching her family, Amelia felt a wave of gratitude so intense it almost brought her to her knees. This was her life. This was her family. This was everything she had never known she wanted, everything she had been searching for without realizing it. And it had all started with a mountain man who had looked at a girl with a twisted leg and seen not a burden, but treasure worth carrying. Years continued to unfold like the seasons, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. Grace married her young man in a ceremony at the cabin, with half the town of Julian making the trek up the mountain to celebrate. It was the largest gathering the Rourke homestead had ever seen, and Xavier grumbled about the noise while secretly being pleased that his daughter was so loved. Thomas did become a carpenter, splitting his time between Julian and the homestead, building a reputation for fine craftsmanship. He married a practical, intelligent woman named Emma, and they settled in Julian, though they visited the mountain cabin often. Rose surprised everyone by deciding to become a teacher. She went to Sacramento for training, then returned to open a small school in Julian. She remained close to her parents, spending summers at the cabin and bringing her students letters and drawings to share with Amelia and Xavier. Samuel, the baby, grew into a quiet, thoughtful boy who loved the mountains even more than his father did. He learned everything Xavier could teach him about tracking, trapping, and survival. By the time he was 15, he could navigate the high country as well as any grown man. Amelia and Xavier grew older together, their hair silvering, their bodies marked by years of hard work and mountain living. But the love between them never dimmed. If anything, it grew stronger, tempered by shared experience and deepened by time. When Amelia was 55, she woke one morning to find Xavier watching her with an expression of such tenderness it took her breath away. "What is it?" she asked, smiling. "I was just thinking," he said, "about the day I carried you up that mountain. How angry I was that anyone had put you in that situation. How determined I was to get you to safety. You saved my life that day." "No," he said softly. "You saved mine, I just did not know it yet." She reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. We saved each other. Yes, he agreed. We did. They lay like that for a while, hands clasped, watching the morning light creep across the cabin walls. Outside, a bird sang. The world was waking up, beginning another day. And they would begin it together, as they had every day for more than 30 years. When they finally rose and went about their morning routine, Amelia found herself thinking about that first winter, when she had been so afraid, so uncertain. She had thought her life was ending, that she would spend whatever remained of it merely surviving. She had been so wrong. Her life had not ended when her father left her and Julian. It had begun. Everything before that had been prologue. This here with Xavier and their children and the life they had built together in these wild mountains, this was the story. And it was still being written. One day at a time, the seasons turned. Summer gave way to fall, fall to winter. Snow came again to the high country, blanketing everything in white silence. Amelia and Xavier settled into the rhythm of winter, as they had for so many years. But this year felt different somehow. Special. On Christmas Eve, their children and grandchildren came up the mountain. It was rare for everyone to gather at once, the journey difficult and the timing often impossible to arrange. But this year, somehow they had all managed it. The cabin was full to bursting. 3 generations of Rourkes packed into the space Xavier had built with his own hands. There was laughter and noise and warmth and love, so much love that Amelia felt like her heart might burst from the fullness of it. After supper, when the children were settled by the fire and the adults were lingering over coffee, Grace raised her cup in a toast. To Mama and Papa, she said, her voice carrying over the general conversation. For building this, for showing us what love looks like, for giving us a home that is more than just a place but a feeling. A belonging. To Mama and Papa, the others echoed, raising their own cups. Amelia felt tears streaming down her face, and she did not bother to hide them. Xavier pulled her close, his own eyes bright. Thank you, he said to their gathered family. All of you, for being here, for carrying on what we started. We learned from the best, Thomas said simply. Later that night, when the house had finally quieted and everyone was asleep, Amelia and Xavier stood on the porch together, looking up at the stars. The sky was clear and cold, and the Milky Way spread across the heavens like a river of light. I love you, Amelia said. I have loved you for so long, but I need to say it again. I love you, Xavier Rourke. Every day more than the day before. I love you too, he said, pulling her into his arms. You are my life, Amelia, my heart. Everything good in my world starts and ends with you. They stood like that for a long time, 2 people who had found each other against impossible odds, who had chosen each other every day since. The mountains rose around them, eternal and unchanging. But here in this moment, change was all around them. Their children were grown. Grandchildren were being raised. The life they had built was spreading, branching out like a tree reaching for the sun, and at the heart of it all was this: a mountain man and a woman with a twisted leg who had looked at each other and seen not limitations but possibilities. Who had chosen love when the world said they should not. Who had built something beautiful and lasting in a harsh and unforgiving place. When they finally went back inside, they found Samuel still awake, sitting by the dying fire. Could not sleep? Xavier asked. I was thinking, Samuel said. About staying here, I mean. On the mountain, building my own cabin nearby. Learning the trap lines from you, Papa. Carrying on what you have started. Xavier and Amelia exchanged a look. Then Xavier nodded slowly. I would like that, he said. I would like that very much. Then it is settled, Samuel said, smiling. I will stay, and Amelia knew in that moment that their story would continue long after they were gone. Their children would tell it to their grandchildren, who would tell it to their own children. The story of how a mountain man had carried a woman with a twisted leg over the pass like treasure. How they had fallen in love and built a life together. How they had proven that love could flourish anywhere, even in the wild and lonely mountains. It was a good story, a true story. And the best part was, it was not over yet. The years rolled on, gentle and full. Amelia and Xavier aged into their 60s, then their 70s, their bodies slowing but their minds still sharp, their love still strong. They became the elders of their growing family, the foundation on which everything else was built. Samuel did build his cabin, just a short walk from his parents' home. He married a woman from Julian, brought her up the mountain, and started his own family. The sound of children's laughter once again filled the high meadow, echoing off the mountainsides. On Amelia's 70th birthday, the whole family gathered again. It was summer, and the weather was perfect, warm and clear. They ate outside, long tables set up in the meadow, laden with food. After the meal, Grace stood and raised her glass. Mama, Papa, we have something for you, she said. She gestured, and Thomas came forward carrying a large wooden box. Inside was a quilt, exquisitely made, each square telling a part of their story. There was the cabin, stitched in careful detail. The mountain pass where Xavier had carried Amelia to safety. Their wedding day. Each of their children as babies. Scenes from the life they had built together, captured in fabric and thread. We all worked on it, Rose said. All of us, even the grandchildren. We wanted you to have something that showed how much you mean to us, how grateful we are for the life you have given us." Amelia could not speak through her tears. She reached out and touched the quilt, her fingers tracing the stitches, seeing their whole life laid out before her in bright colors and careful craftsmanship. It was beautiful. It was perfect. "Thank you," Xavier said, his voice thick with emotion. "All of you." He stopped, overcome. "Thank you." That night, lying in bed with the quilt spread over them, Amelia and Xavier held each other close. "We did it," Amelia whispered. "We built something good, something that will last." "We did," Xavier agreed. "But more than that, we loved each other. Every day in all the ways that mattered. That is what will last. Not the cabin or the life we built, but the love." "Yes," Amelia said, "the love." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in the quilt their family had made, wrapped in each other's arms, wrapped in the love that had sustained them through more than 40 years of marriage. The end, when it came, was peaceful. Xavier passed away in his sleep on a winter night, at the age of 82. He simply did not wake up one morning, his heart having finally given out after a lifetime of hard work and fierce love. Amelia grieved deeply, but she did not break. She had loved him for 50 years, and that love had made her strong. She lived another 5 years after his passing, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, still sharp and witty and full of stories. On the evening before she died, Samuel came to sit with her. She was in the cabin she had shared with Xavier, the place where they had built their life together. Outside, snow was falling, soft and quiet. "Tell me about the day Papa carried you over the pass," Samuel said, as he had asked her to do countless times before. And Amelia, her voice weak but her memory clear, told him once again. About the fall, the fear, the pain, and then Xavier, appearing like something out of a legend, climbing down that impossible slope to reach her. How he had carried her to safety, up the mountain to his cabin. How she had looked into his pale blue eyes and known somehow that she was home. "He carried me like I was treasure," she said softly, "and he never stopped. Every day of our marriage he carried me in one way or another, and I carried him. That is what love is." Samuel, carrying each other, seeing each other truly and choosing to lift each other up again and again no matter how hard the path. Samuel nodded, tears on his cheeks. "I will remember, Mama, we all will. Your story, yours and Papa's, we will tell it forever." "Good," Amelia said. She closed her eyes, a small smile on her face. "That is good." She passed away peacefully in the night, joining Xavier wherever he had gone, and her children kept their promise. They told the story, and their children told it, and their children after that. The story of Amelia Grace Rourke, whose leg was twisted from birth, and Xavier Rourke, the mountain man who had carried her over the pass on his shoulders like treasure, who had seen past her limitation to the strength beneath, who had loved her truly and completely until the very end. It was a story about love, about choosing each other despite the odds, about building something lasting in a harsh world, and most of all, it was a story about being seen. Really seen for exactly who you are, and being loved all the more for it. In the mountains of California, the cabin still stands, weathered but strong. And on clear nights, when the wind whispers through the pines, you can almost hear the echo of laughter, the sound of children playing. The story lives on, carried forward through generations. A reminder that love, true love, can flourish anywhere, that the right person will carry you through any hardship, over any mountain. That being different is not a weakness but a strength, when you find someone who sees you clearly. And in the end, that is the greatest treasure of all.